Howdy Pushers, and welcome to episode 23 of Pushing Cardboard, the Pumpkin Spice Edition. I'm your host, Grant Lindeberg, and fall is in the air. Okay, actually this is the World War II in the Desert edition, as today we'll be looking at two games from that theater, and as well as all the usual chatter, I have an extended essay today at the end dealing with a recent brouhaha about how much history do we want in our games. But first, the fun stuff. I'd like to say thanks for all the terrific feedback in the previous episode. I received emails, comments on the website, new signups to the website, and lots of traffic on the Discord server, lots of great ideas for topics or segments, and lots of feedback on how things are going. I really appreciate it. So to that end, just like last episode, if you've got a question you'd like answered or a topic discussed, drop by the website or drop me a line at grant@pushingcardboard.com. I'd be happy to add a mailbag portion to the podcast, and topic ideas are appreciated even when I can't act on them. News. It's been a bit over a month since the last episode, and GMT has had 2 newsletters out in that period. So I'll just pick out the highlights, or at least the highlights for me. Even if I mentioned it last time, it's worth repeating. GMT is now offering a yearly sheet of replacement and errata counters for just $3 shipping in the US or $8 elsewhere. So you no longer have to buy C3I magazine just to get the updated GMT counters if you don't want the rest of the magazine. I've heard some bellyaching online about this, with folks complaining that they aren't free. I just don't get it. All you pay is a cut of the postage. Really, they're almost free, and they're now available, whereas previously they weren't. It's a giant improvement. I mean, come on, suck it up, friends. Also new on the P500 list is yet another volume of Last 100 Yards. Volume 5 is called For King and Country and brings in the Brits and the Canadians, so I'm pretty pumped. The only downside is I think it's a really weak title considering ASL also uses For King and Country as the title of their British expansion. And the box cover looks like yet another use of one of the Arnhem photos, but man, whatever, still an instant buy for me. GMT is also coming out with a second edition of Caesar, Rome vs. Gaul, as well as an update kit for owners of the original edition. I assume this is in response to initial chatter that the game was unbalanced. This upgrade is not without controversy, as many commentators have figured out how to play the more difficult side and now worry that this upgrade will tip the balance too far in the other direction. It's a really fun game, so I sure hope they get it right. GMT is also coming out with a second edition of Mr. President, along with an update kit. Apparently there were enough niggling errata and balance issues to warrant this approach over a simple reprint. And there's a new printing of For the People with a brand new map by Terry Leeds. The map and a big box can be purchased separately if you already have the game but want the map. Volume 7 of Levy and Campaign is on P500. It's called Zizka. I was hanging out in the excellent LNC Discord server and heard that they aim for 2 releases per year going forward. Man, as much as I'm enjoying this series, that's just too much for me. I'm still playing Inferno and I pretty much skipped Almoravid. But if you're a real Levy and Campaign fan, I guess that's good news for you. And also, they have announced their first Levy and Campaign Ancients game, a sort of a new series. So, Levy and Campaign, they're everywhere. Shipping soon will be Downfall from GMT. I think I might have just got my notice about it today. This was a game that the late Chad Jensen was working on when he passed away. His friend and fellow designer, John Butterfield, has picked up the files and finished it off. It's an interesting game set at the end of World War II. One player is the Soviets and one is the Western Allies. But then the Soviet player also plays the German West Front units, and the Allied player also plays the German East Front units. I imagine this alone will generate a lot of interest. GMT also has their Weekend at the Warehouse event coming up in October. I'm going to miss it this time as I'll be going to San Diego HistCon a few weeks later. But as regular listeners know, I heartily recommend GMT West. Check it out if you get a chance. Legion Wargames has a sale on for select titles, as well as CPO pricing for 4 new games. CPO is their pre-order discount. It's sort of like P500, I suppose. A Glorious Chance, a naval game set on Lake Ontario in 1813 by Gina Willis caught my eye. Sadly for me, it's solitaire, but perhaps not sadly for you. Looks like a very cool game. Over at Compass, the news is that Silent War 2nd Edition has shipped. It's solitaire as well, so I didn't order it, but I've seen a lot of posts about it. People seem very happy with the update. Have you heard of Assault Games? They put out a tactical World War II East Front game a while ago called Red Horizon 41. And now they're kickstarting their new project in that system, Sicily 43. Wolfgang, the head honcho over there, got in touch with me to tell about the company and his new game. So check out the article on pushingcardboard.com for more information. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. Worthington Games has a new game for pre-order from Morris Suckling, Crisis 1914. Not exactly a war game, more of a political game, playable with 1 to 5 players. Decision Games has announced that they're finally wrapping up their pre-order pricing for Axis Empires, the new deluxe version of Axis Empires that has both Totaler Krieg and Dicenso in it. The pre-order price is $240 US, so I can't imagine what the final price is going to be, but it's going to be a giant box, and that's a well-loved game, so it'll be interesting to see how that works out. What's on my table? My most recent scenario of absolute war ended in defeat for my Soviets. Wendell and I are moving on to This War Without an Enemy. We previously played a couple of games of Unhappy King Charles, so it's going to be interesting to try a new game on that topic. In terms of ASL, I'm still playing Crossing the Moro. I've also started a scenario from Red Barricades with an old friend, sort of as a ramp-up to playing that historical module. And my French lost in First Virtue in a close game where I ran out of time. Now we're playing Last Defense Line. So ASL continues full bore despite having been ghosted by one of my opponents recently. My Death in the Trenches game continues. It's such a novel system. So many mini events that skew the game in small directions and large each turn. And the combat system has a crazy mechanic. Once you know how many strength points you have in a battle, you choose how many dice to roll. And as long as you don't roll over the number of strength points you have, you generate that many hits. But if you do roll over, you get no hits. Definitely one to bite the gamblers among us in the ass. Storm over Arnhem is in its last few turns. I fear I may have calculated the VPs incorrectly as we were going, but it's been great fun along the way, however it turns out. The Palestine scenario of the British Way continues. The game feels like it's going so quickly. Neither of us really opt for the event rather than the ops in this game. It feels like there's just not enough ops opportunities. Every once in a while, an event is powerful enough to make you grab it, but mostly it's just ops. Not War, but Murder is also ongoing. My Union boy still can't seem to crack his line, and he's been able to blow every damn bridge along the way. Hopefully I can string him out wide enough to create a weak point. And then also still on the table are combat Commands and Colors, Napoleon, Combat Commander, and Last 100 Yards. Also my A Most Fearful Sacrifice game ended, and we've moved on to Kernston from the Blind Sword series. We're playing the first battle at Kernston there. And then, of course, also from that series, A Greater Victory, still playing that. It's in its last turns. And, oh, man, I've also been playing the early scenarios from Inferno and playing Nevsky on Rally the Troops. So, yeah, I've got pretty much my slate is more than full right now in terms of play-by-mail games or asynchronous games. New games to the collection. Yeah, a few new games again this time. Couldn't help myself. I managed to get a used copy of a game that had been a bit of a grail game for me. The West Wall Quad from SPI. I got it from a US seller who found a way to ship it to me for only $19 US. I've always been told that the shipping from the U.S. to Canada is just overwhelmingly huge and prohibitive. But I'm starting to think now that maybe some of the U.S. sellers just don't want to look to find decent shipping prices because $19 that was a hell of a deal. It's out of my hands when they arrive category, I had a couple things from pre-order come in. Arden 2 from MMP, as well as Plantagenet and Simonich's North Africa 41 from GMT. And then in another bit of fishing for used treasures, I got a copy of Salerno 1943 used. It's the game from MMP, which uses something called the variable combat system. I don't know. Everything's a system with these guys, though. I don't know if there are any other games in this particular series, but it was a decent price, and I thought I'd check it out. And then finally, Revolution had a sale, so I got the final 2 Blind Swords games I didn't own, Kernstown and Longstreet Attacks. And as the price was good and I could save on shipping, I also got Fury at Midway and Pacific Fury, 2 small World War II Pacific games from Japanese designer Yasushi Nakaguru. On the plus side, or at least for my wallet and my shelves, I also moved a couple more games to my to-be-traded or donated closet. So there's a few things going out as well as all that stuff coming in. Okay, let's go to the desert and talk about games, or start by talking about one game. The first game I'd like to talk about is Desert Victory, North Africa, 1940-42 by Trevor Bender, that came out in the most recent C3I magazine, and it uses the same general system as his Kursk game from a few years ago. Key differences are that there is some stacking in this game, though it's dead simple to keep track of the stacking limits here. And there's a robust set of supply rules here, as you'd expect in this theater. In fact, absent one side or the other pushing their opponent right off the map, victory is determined by who can move their supply head furthest from their base. In his design notes, Trevor Bender says he was looking to create a game that captured the entire conflict in the desert, other than Tunisia, in a 3 to 4 hour game. That's an attractive idea, so how does it work? We have a fairly familiar map that is not deep, but very wide, stretching from Agalia to Alexandria. Hexes are 25 miles across, but in this game, units are generally divisions and brigades with a few corps, whereas the Kursk game was corps and armies, hence the no stacking rule in that game. The map is further divided up into 7 sections, east to west, with Tobruk being located in the center section. As you move forward, you get to move your supply head forward, but you'll probably always have units forward of your supply head. For every map section ahead of the supply head one of your units is, its attack and movement points are reduced. It's a fairly simple and elegant way to allow some of the sweeping flanking movements and maneuvering without letting units just go anywhere. Units are fairly familiar to hex and counter games, just 2 values, combat and movement. As well, all units are either armored or leg units in terms of movement. And finally, they come in 3 sizes: brigades with 1x, divisions, 2 x's, and corps, 3 x's. I only mention the x's because the stacking limit is in x's. It's 6 x's. So it's easy to see at a glance if a hex is overstacked. As well, the divisions and corps are generally 2-step units, meaning they get flipped over to a lesser rated side before being eliminated, while the brigades are a single step. Supply is handled very differently here from the Kursk game. On the turn track, each side gets a set number of supply points as well as replacement points each turn. The former can be carried over from turn to turn, but the latter have to be spent when granted. Replacement points can be used to rebuild lost steps or rebuild eliminated units. Whoever has the most accumulated supply points has the initiative for the current turn and will go first. But before that, both players choose their posture. This is similar to Kursk in the selection, but the postures are very different here, and you can skip between them without paying a penalty, unlike in the other game. The posture choices are straightforward. Operations posture lets you move and fight. Engineering posture lets you place mines or dig in. And reorganization posture lets you remove all the disrupted counters from your units. All these choices cost you a supply point. Or you can select pause and pay no supply. Both players reveal their posture choice, and then the initiative player proceeds with theirs, followed by the non-initiative player. If either player still has supply left, you secretly choose a posture again and repeat the sequence until both players pass or are out of supply. If you choose operations as your posture, you get to move any and all of your units and then initiate battle in any hexes where you're adjacent to the enemy. Movement is easy with differing hex costs depending mostly on whether you're on a road, a track, or open ground, or cross an escarpment. The game uses a mechanic that designer Bender calls slippery zones of control. Each division and corps, but not brigade, exerts a normal zone of control into its 6 adjacent hexes, as long as it could theoretically move into those hexes, so not across escarpment hex sides, for example. If you move into an enemy zone of control, you must stop. But the slippery part is this. Your stopped unit cancels the zone of control in that hex now, so you can now move your other units through that hex without stopping. This leads to some possibilities for flanking and encircling. There's no penalty for leaving a zone of control other than if you move directly into another zone of control, you must stop. After movement, all battles are pre-designated. Combat is fairly familiar, with the attacking hex adding up its combat factors and comparing them to the defending hex's factors to arrive at an initial odds column on the combat results table. Terrain may double the defender's factors, but from there, it's a series of combat shifts of the column. Having both armored and infantry units will give you a shift unless your opponent also has both. If either side is not in supply, there will be a negative shift for them. But the big one here is adjacent supporting units. Any units adjacent to either the attacker's or defender's hex that is not involved in another combat can give you a shift. And note that this is per unit with no regard to size or combat value. So you get a shift for every unit. So a small brigade gives a shift just like a big corps. Once you arrive at a final odds column, it's a single 6-sider that generally gives results for both attacker and defender. Results can be disruption, step loss, and retreat, or any combination of the same. And if you are attacking on a poor odds column, these bad things are more likely to happen to the attacker than the defender. After any retreats, the attacking units and any supporting units can advance. Armor goes the same distance the defender retreated, but leg units can only ever advance a single hex, regardless of the length of retreat. As the CRT generates a lot of disrupted results for both the attacker and defender, the occasional use of the reorganization posture is needed. Disrupted markers reduce a unit's combat and movement values by 1 each. The engineering posture allows you to create 2 improved positions for yourself. These give you a 2-column shift when defending, so they're worth using, especially if you get across the mid-map section and want to hold on to your gains. Once both players have passed or run out of supply, the turn ends and it's on to the next one. We'll have a new amount of supply for each side as well as a new bit of replacements. There's also reinforcements each turn that arrive directly on the board at or adjacent to your supply head. So there's none of that having to move everybody up from Alexandria or Agalia every turn. I guess I should also mention a little more about the supply heads in detail. Each of the 7 supply sections has a main port, Tobruk, Derna, Mersa Matruth, etc. These are where the supply heads are placed. If you manage to capture the port where my supply head is located, my supply head immediately shifts back 1 section towards my base to the next port back. It doesn't immediately move yours forward. That happens at the end of the turn if you still control the port. As well, there's special rules for Derna, Bardia, and Tobruk. They're special fortresses. A certain amount of units can withdraw into these forts and then get a double defense in there. Also, if the enemy withdraws into Tobruk, you can trace your supply line past them via the Tobruk bypass road. But in terms of Derna and Bardia, you have to take both of them to move your supply past them. There's 10 turns to the game, and whoever has their supply head farther away from their base wins. When I first played the game, I was stumped as to how the Allies could push the Axis supply head all the way back to Agalia, but in time I managed to do it. Mostly I had to forget everything I'd learned in the Kursk game. The slippery Zoks have to be exploited, and then remember that there's no out-of-supply status. If a unit gets too far forward, it's going to lose too much of its combat and movement allowance to be effective, but that's it. One of my big complaints about games set in this theater is that they often don't incentivize the player to create the big pushes that happen in real life. In the war, the Italians push towards Bardia, then we're pushed back past Benghazi. Rommel arrives, pushes all the way to Alamein, which is almost Alexandria, and then it's pushed all the way back across the desert. Too many games place the emphasis on the final location. And well, it's the same here in terms of that final location. The Brits must push the Axis back as far as possible to make the Germans have to spend dearly to make their own push once the Afrika Korps arrives. Because the Brits will get an advantage in reinforcements and supply in the final turns. So the German really needs to have, in turn, pushed the Allies back as far as possible. I suppose the Allies could just try to hold the line at Tobruk and never push past. That would be giving up ground and probably giving up replacement points. Because if you don't attack and take some losses, those replacement points are just lost. In my game so far, it's seen the line swing back and forth quite a bit. In one game where the line was more static because of the size of the forces engaged, it suddenly became a race to try to outflank. Very fun stuff. And to its credit, it does play in an evening, as Trevor Bender wanted. He's achieved his design goal here. There's a good-looking vassal module available for the game, but I haven't tried it as I've played all of these with the regular the cardboard on the table. But as I said, it's a good-looking module, so I hope to try that out as well. Okay, in contrast, let's take a look at a game from Avalon Hill's classic years, Afrika Korps. Published in 1964 and designed by Avalon Hill and board gaming's founder Charles S. Roberts, this is a game that stood the test of time as it's still played occasionally today. It uses the classic original combat results table. It's old enough that even though it uses hexes, the rules refer to them as squares. The counters are single-sided, and the counter colors are blue and pink, which I totally don't mind. Really easy to tell apart. The game covers the same basic area as Desert Victory, that is from Magalia in the west to almost Alexandria in the east. But there's more hexes on this map, meaning each hex represents less territory. And of course, this map is considerably less beautiful. Mustard yellow sand, a few brown escarpments, and a red highway, and a few other black markings. But it's charming in its old school way, totally functional. The units here average a step down as well. There's no corps here. Instead, we have mostly brigades, regiments, and battalions with a few Italian divisions, which means there are more counters than in Desert Victory as well, as the order of battle is a slightly lower level. Besides the unit IDs, the counters have 3 strength factors here: attack, defense, and movement. It's a bit different from the other game as well in that it used a single combat factor per unit with no difference between attack and defense values. NATO symbols distinguish units between armor and infantry, and there's also supply units for each side. Turns here are monthly rather than seasonal, so a full game is 19 turns, even though it starts in April 41, whereas Desert Victory starts in the 3rd quarter of 1940. Like Desert Victory, there's a reinforcement schedule of new units for both sides, but unlike Desert Victory, there are no replacements for used units until March 42, so losses are losses for the first 2/3 of the game. Movement is similar to the other game, but zones of control work differently. Here there's no slippery zox. Well, there sort of is, but it's pretty tricky to achieve. If you move into an enemy zone of control, you must stop. The only exception is if you manage to pile up a 7-to-1 odds advantage in attack factors. After that, you can move units through your attacking hex and even through the defending hex. Stacking is simple here as well. It's a straight 3 units per hex, regardless of size. You can overstack while moving through a hex, but you can't end your movement overstacked. Supply units don't count towards stacking limits. Both sides have a small amount of supply units. The British have a maximum of 4 on board each turn, and the Axis have a maximum of 3. Each turn, the British receives 1 more. The Germans have a small supply table to roll on. They may receive 1 each turn as well if their supply isn't sunk on the way. Supply is important as every attacking hex needs to be within 5 hexes of a supply unit to be able to attack. Multiple attackers can all pull supply from the same supply unit. Once a supply unit has been used this way, it's removed from the board. So you've got to plan your attacks carefully. No risky attacks if they consume supply, as that's a bad use of your supply, obviously. Combat has a lot of the classic era rules. every attacking unit that moves adjacent to a defender must attack. If multiple attacking units are adjacent to multiple defending units, all defending units must be attacked. A single unit's attack factors must attack a single unit. It cannot be split between two attacks. And no unit may attack more than once per turn, and no defending unit may be attacked more than once per turn. This leads to classic situations where an attacker will use a single unit to attack one hex at bad odds, while the rest of his attacking force can get better odds against the rest of the defenders. Old school gamers call this a soak-off, and it's one of wargaming's earliest gamey tactics, but it's described as a soak-off in the rules, and you're encouraged to do it, so don't be queasy. Soak off away. The combat player aid card is a gem here. As well as the small CRT itself at the top of the page, the bottom of the page has a giant chart to show you how to calculate odds. All the possible defender totals are along the x-axis, and all the attacker totals are on the y-axis. Plug in the two numbers, cross-index, and you find your odds column. How sweet they provided this for early war gamers who are by now so totally accustomed to calculating their odds on their own. The CRT itself is small and to the point. I think it's the exact same as several of the other early classic Avalon Hill games from this period. The results are straightforward, and there's a single result for any roll. One side or the other can be eliminated, one side or the other can be forced to retreat 2 squares, or there's an exchange where the defender is eliminated and the attacker must remove units with as many attack factors as the defender had defense factors. Pretty straightforward stuff, with an option for the attacker to advance into the defender's hex if it's empty after the attack. Oh, and there's a doubling of the defender's defense values for units on an escarpment or a fortress hex. So all really straightforward stuff. The other thing to note about combat is that enemy supply units can also be captured, and it works pretty much as you'd expect. The enemy loses that supply, and you gain to use it as you please, and it doesn't count against your maximum supply level. In Afrika Korps, the Germans have to either wipe the Brits off the map or take Alamein and the 2 fortress hexes, Tobruk and Benghazi, and hold them for 2 turns. The Brits can similarly win instantly by taking and holding Agalia and the same 2 fortress hexes for 2 turns, or by eliminating all the Axis units. If neither of these instant victory conditions are met, the Allies win, so there's a bit more pressure on the German player to attack. I bought my copy of this game maybe 10 years ago. They're easy to find and reasonably priced on the used market if you're happy with a player's copy. But I don't have the long history with this game that some players have. Well, it's a much-loved game. It has a reputation for often coming down to a 3-to-1 odds attack on Tobruk. I'm not sure if that's a 3-to-1 attack by the Germans or the Brits, or even if that's true, but it's certainly the thing you hear tossed around by veteran players with the game. But one great thing about these old Avalon Hill games is there's an absolute treasure trove of history and strategy articles about them. With the general magazine as well as third-party magazines like Fire and Movement, there was a seemingly never-ending stream of articles about these old games. I suppose a big part of that is that there were far fewer games published every year, so the magazines couldn't rely on a constant stream of new games for all their content. But it also reflects how well certain games were loved and played to death. The old general magazines are pretty easy to find online as PDFs. I hardly recommend them. So, how do the 2 games compare? Well, interestingly, their playtimes are fairly similar, even though Afrika Korps has more units and more turns. It's a bit of misdirection in that a turn in Desert Victory can have several impulses as long as one side still has supply. So I'd say both games are still probably in the 3 to 4 hour range, although shorter is certainly possible as things can go sideways in a hurry. Movement is similar, but the zones of control work very differently. Desert Victory and its slippery Zocs allow for a bit more fluid battlefield, but on the other hand, because the unit size in Africa is smaller and there are more units, you can accomplish some of the same swings and flanking maneuvers. In most games, most of the units will still stay fairly close to the coastal highway, but there is room to try and swing around. Map room, I mean. Combat is very different, even if both use an odds-based combat results table. Afrika Korps is much bloodier, with units quickly eliminated if you're not careful. Desert Victory is more subtle, with step losses and plenty of disruption results rather than strict losses and retreats. The whole combat system in Desert Victory is more nuanced and finely modulated, whereas the old game's results feel coarse in comparison. I suppose that's what 60 years of game development can do. It's the same thing with the supply rules. Though I'd say the Afrika Korps ones aren't all that outdated. There's many games with similar rules. Panzer Army Africa has trucks all over the place. Even the very new Africa 41 by Mark Simonich has supply units and depots moving about. But Desert Victory has a very new device with its use of supply heads and supply zones. It makes sense that Trevor Bender put so much thought into crafting an elegant mechanic for supply, as is always a key part of any game set in the desert of World War II. The victory conditions are a bit less harsh in Desert Victory as well, but the onus is still slightly on the Axis as the Allies win if the situation is tied. Of more interest to me is the swing of battle. Desert Victory really addresses this in a way as it in no way rewards either player for simply holding the line. Afrika Korps tries to incentivize players to dash across the desert through its automatic victory conditions where you win if you take your opponent's home base as well as the two fortresses. I haven't played enough to see how often that can happen for the Brits. Maybe they do well just to sit back and try to hold off Rommel. I'm not sure. If you're a veteran player, drop by the website and let us know. I won't do anything as tricky as pick a winner between these two. I'd certainly play either. I'd probably rather play the newer game, I suppose, as it's a little smoother and it's got a few new tricks up its sleeve. But I'll hang on to Afrika Korps and play it if asked. It still scratches that desert itch, and I like to play the old games once in a while. It's always interesting to reflect on how far we've come and how much is still the same. Okay, for my bouquets and parting shots this episode, they're one and the same. I want to talk about a project that I'm very enthusiastic about, and I'm glad that they're doing, and so I give them bouquets. But I do have a few quibbles with what they're doing as well. So, have you listened to the podcast We Intend to Move on Your Works? It's part of the Homo Ludens podcast feed. It's a really interesting project where two players are working their way through a huge number of American Civil War titles, for the most part chronologically by battle. Each episode, they take a look at a specific battle, give its history, and then tell us about the game they played on that particular battle. And then they also give their thoughts on if or how the design of that game has been influenced by the Lost Cause movement. For those unfamiliar, the Lost Cause movement was an effort after the war to cast the Confederacy in a more favorable light. It tries to make the South look like a valiant but doomed set of defenders who never had a chance against the Northern aggressors. It does many things, but chief among them is it denies that the war was fundamentally about slavery. The Lost Cause line of thought has been thoroughly rebuffed and discounted, but it still has its adherents, not to mention its effect on history. All those Confederate statues that are being mothballed or pulled down these days, they were all put up as part of the Lost Cause narrative. So even though it's clear that the Lost Cause is bogus, its effects still linger in books and imaginations, and that filters into the games we play. Anyway, the two players, Stuart and Pierre, and their host Fred Serval, grapple with the thorny question of whether or not each game in question has any residue of Lost Cause thinking in it. I sometimes feel Stuart finds more than is there, but I gotta say, he's more knowledgeable on the subject than me, so perhaps he's right. I have to say, his historical notes on each battle before they start talking about the game is my favorite part of each episode. Stuart is well read on the war and has extensive knowledge of the battles and the overall war. As well, though he now resides in Ireland, I think, he's a born and bred Virginian, so this history stuff is all stuff he grew up with, Land of Lee and all that. I should also say, as a side note, on the podcast, Stuart is American but living in Ireland, or somewhere that's drifted into his speech a bit. Pierre is actually English, and Fred is French, but lives in London, I think. So it's a great diversity of perspectives from these three. Hats off to Stuart for coming up with this whole idea and for the whole Lost Cause angle as well. As well as the podcast, Stuart also has a website where he talks about all kinds of games, including the ones in this series, but also other American Civil War games that they don't get to or are solitaire. I mentioned that as his blog kicked up a fair bit of pushback a week ago when Stuart published a review of a game on Pickett's Charge. He liked the game all right, but decreed that the choice of Pickett's Charge as a topic was a bit of Lost Causeism. Pickett's charge was the final attack by the Confederates at Gettysburg. It was doomed before it began. Longstreet knew that and was against it, but it went in anyway as Lee wanted it. It's been warped in history into the final high water mark for the South, but that's only part of why Stuart doesn't like it. Stuart objects to the topic in total because if you win, you're winning for the Confederacy and prolonging slavery. While he likes the game system, he would prefer it didn't celebrate a lost cause hero, but perhaps was used in a game about a Union attack. Well, I could go along with his desire not to promote or extend the lie of the lost cause. A little alarm bell went off in my head. It made me ask him how he'd feel about playing the South in a grand strategic game on the war, or the Germans in a similar game on World War II. He told me he can't do it with the Germans, but he doesn't play much World War II anyway, and he wasn't sure about the Civil War. So far, they're planning mostly battle games, but as Pickett's charge showed, he's sensitive to playing the slavery promoting side. So, in the next episode of We Intend to Move On Your Works podcast, it all came to a head. For me, anyway. After another great introduction to the Battle of Shiloh, they got down to discussing how much they did not enjoy the game they played, Into the Woods, part of the Great Battles of the American Civil War series. I haven't played any GBACW since the early iterations in strategy and tactics magazines, but I think I probably agree with most of the things they don't like about the game. Huge series rule book, and then a huge extensive game rule book as well. Really fiddly procedures, lots of marker counters, very long to play, even a short scenario. Sounds a lot like stuff I don't care for either. But then Stuart asked the killer question: where are the slaves? In a system so detailed, why are the slaves not represented? If the war is about slavery, why are they not there? This is where Stuart and I part company. Well, actually, I don't usually like the same games he likes and vice versa, but that's just taste in games. This felt something bigger. To me, the reason there's no enslaved people in that game is that it's a battle game. The war was certainly about slavery, but the individual battles aren't. Shiloh, I think, was about control of the Tennessee and Mississippi rivers. Nearby Corinth was a major rail hub, so it was about control of transportation. Those are the objectives, sure. The larger objectives have to do with the future of slavery in new states as they come online, and thereby its continued existence in the South. But every war gamer knows this, or else they don't want to. There's no need for every battle game to spell it out. My limited imagination has no idea what enslaved units would look like in a game like this, a game that focuses on the military kinetic aspects of the battle. I just fundamentally disagree that a battle game set in the Civil War needs to keep the issue of slavery front and center. Perhaps someone will design a game that Stuart needs, or that suits Stuart's needs. It's not this one, and I guess part of what gets me about the podcast discussion here is he's not criticizing the game for what it is, but for not being what he wants it to be. Or perhaps he was just using it to get to his bigger point, that he thinks slavery needs to be highlighted and centered in American Civil War games. I don't agree with him. If some players just want games that deal with the military aspects of a battle or even an entire war, so be it. Perhaps these two reviews by Stuart have hit a nerve with many players because his tone suggests that we're not engaging with history correctly if we don't follow his lead. I hope that's not actually what he feels, but I have no idea. When it comes to a grand strategic game of the whole war, Stuart is on firmer ground, perhaps. Grand strategic games often benefit from the inclusion of politics, even if they only directly impact the kinetic events. But I'm still very happy to play a game like Mark Simonich's The U.S. Civil War. There's no counters there for enslaved peoples, no real centering of slavery in the game. But when I play, I know what the war is about, whether I'm playing the good guys or not. This whole thing got me thinking of a couple different players I met along the way who wouldn't play the Germans in World War II games. One was very eager to play, so we had to go at a Stalingrad game. I was the Germans, of course, and I won. He complained that the game was imbalanced. I offered to switch sides, but he refused to play the Germans. So catch-22. The other fellow was a big fan of Wing Leader, but again refused to play the Germans. Talking to him about it, he went so far as to say he couldn't play them and didn't understand anyone who could. So what was he implying? That anyone who played the Germans was somehow a Nazi sympathizer? What about if you played the Soviets? Were you then pro-Stalin? what if you played the British? Were you saying you were cool with how Churchill treated the Indians? And then, of course, the big question in my mind, if everyone who wants to play the Germans is beneath contempt, who the hell did this guy expect to play with? Stuart says he can't play the Germans because he can't not think about the Holocaust, which is fair enough. But that's not everyone's experience. I'm glad that he isn't also asking for the Holocaust to be centered in every operational or battle World War II game. We could go on like this. I'm sure there's people who can't play Labyrinth without thinking of the American use of torture, or Vietnam games without napalm, or Pacific World War II games without thinking of the firebombing of Tokyo, or the Japanese treatment of POWs, or the firebombing of Dresden in Europe-centered World War II games. But it's all an arbitrary line. All war is an atrocity, obviously. When we game it, there's nothing actually realistic about it. How we compartmentalize it, what parts we as designers and players want to deal with and look at, is up to each of us individually. So I totally support Stuart's right to express his point of view as much as I disagree with it, and I'll keep listening to the series because, as I said, Stuart's history lessons are terrific. I totally recommend it. This whole issue reflects a wider trend in our hobby. As a recent article in the online magazine Conflict of Interest points out, there's a growing number of folks who want war games to reflect more than just the military aspects of war. They want political and social issues included as well, and I'm all for it. I'm glad to say we're seeing more and more designers attempt this kind of work. Where I disagree is when I see this new trend as being pushed as the only way. The Conflicts of Interest articles does that a bit, which made it an unsatisfying read. And hearing the author interviewed elsewhere didn't disabuse me of that idea. He seemed to be saying that this was the direction the whole hobby needs to move in. I disagree. It's certainly a direction the hobby can move in, but it's not the only one. To bring this back to the We Intend to Move On Your Works podcast, I hope Stuart gets the games he wants, but only if we all get the games we want. There's room for all. Thanks again for listening. You can reach me, as I said, at grant@pushingcardboard.com, at the website or Discord server, or, well, Twitter, if you still go there. Any way you slice it, I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, enjoy your pumpkin spice.